My mentor took his own life on the eve of his retirement, using a fruit knife he'd had for 20 years. He meticulously distributed all his belongings, leaving only a case notebook for me. Lao Zhou patted my arm so hard it made a loud thud. I'm retiring, but my apprentice is here. Don't even think about slacking off. Lao Zhou's methods weren't by the book, but they were honed through years of dealing with street-level thugs. He knew exactly when to tighten the leash to inspire fear, and when to loosen it to avoid pushing too hard. Lao Zhou didn't respond. Steeling himself, he walked out the door with me. To all of them, Lao Zhou was simply Dad. He lay in bed, blood seeping through the sheets and pooling onto the floor, thick and crimson. The sight burned itself into my mind. Director Guo didn't stop me. He handed me Lao Zhou's belongings instead, saying, "He left these specifically for you." Lao Zhou had an eye for talent, and I trust his judgment. Lao Zhou's possessions were so sparse they could fit in a shoebox. Aside from 2 pages of his will, the rest were case notes. He had divided his estate, selling his house and allocating the money to the 137 families in his notebook. The 2-page will expressed his lingering concerns for the people he served. Only the last 2 lines were meant for himself. Through blurred vision, I could barely make out Lao Zhou's face. It was as if I were transported back to 2 years ago when I first started working under him. With his dark face and fierce demeanor, he was as stern and impartial as Bao Zheng, unyielding in his methods and always striking with precision. I didn't respond. After 2 years working with Lao Zhou, I knew he didn't care about such things. In 2004, Lao Zhou, spirited and sharp, was a legendary figure in the police force, fighting crime on the front lines to dispel the darkness. When the gunfire rang out, I failed to leap over the hurdle like Lu Xiang, falling face first into the snowy ground. I chipped a front tooth, and the cold wind poured into my mouth as I spoke. Under the command, Lao Zhou kicked open the door that concealed the truth. Behind it lay not a detestable criminal organization, but the nightmare and inner demons that had haunted him for 20 years. They cheered and celebrated, but no one noticed Lao Zhou's abnormal state. He was questioning, "What is our mission?" Lao Zhou exchanged his accomplishments for a chance to step down from the front lines. The Black Panther disappeared from the criminal investigation team, and a dark-faced community officer took his place. When spring came, my new tooth grew in, a tiny grain that grew into the size of a peanut and firmly rooted itself in my gums. The Black Panther became a legend, his case notes sealed away. Lao Zhou began a new journal, recording the detailed information of every registered household in his jurisdiction. Lao Zhou's funeral was grand. Snow covered the red coffin, adding a solemn touch. Children of all ages surrounded it, crying uncontrollably. Ma Lingling, taking the role of the eldest child, smashed a ceramic bowl as a sign of mourning. The loud sound sent a jolt through my chest, as if I had returned to the winter 20 years ago. Lao Zhou had stepped back from the spotlight. I climbed out of the snowy ground, blood in my mouth, running home with my chipped tooth in hand. My mother teased me, "Still dreaming of being Lu Xiang?" I shook my head and caught a glimpse of Officer Yang Zhan on the TV. Blood dripped from my chin onto my hand. I said, "I want to be a policeman." Lao Zhou loved drinking, especially liquor. He always claimed a drink before a case helped him think more clearly. For this habit, he'd written self-criticisms and been suspended, but he couldn't change. Lao Zhou's fame as the Black Panther was so great that criminals would tremble at the mention of his name. His exceptional skills often let his drinking habit slide under the radar. This was why Lao Zhou was assigned to the murder of Song Yinghua, the founder of the Huitong Foundation. Guo Linhai wasn't happy about it. They had graduated from the police academy together and been colleagues for years, yet why was Lao Zhou always in charge of the big cases? He went to the higher-ups to complain but was dismissed. Lao Zhou leaned casually against the doorframe, grinning as he said to Guo Linhai, "Got rejected, didn't you? Who told you I'm just that good?" Guo Linhai shoved him in frustration, but Lao Zhou wasn't annoyed. He threw an arm over Gui's shoulder. Don't worry, Guezi. When I become the director, you can have your pick of the cases. Get lost. Why should you be director first? Guo punched Lao Zhou in the chest. Back then, the two were young, a pair of jokers who couldn't stay serious. Even outside the Song residence, they were still laughing and joking until a glare from their superior silenced them. When the leader turned away, they exchanged glances and gestures before stepping through the Song residence's door, their expressions turning solemn. There were no signs of struggle or theft. Song Niangua's carotid artery had been severed with a sharp blade, causing blood to spurt out. The time of death was estimated to be between 8:30 and 9 p.m. The weapon was determined to be the fruit knife on the dining table. It was an ordinary knife, commonly sold in supermarkets, hardware stores, and small shops. Fingerprints on the knife belonged to the victim and his daughter, Song Jin. Song Jin had been studying away from home. She returned last month after the scandal involving the Huitong Foundation broke out. Thin. Unnaturally thin, like a child. Dressed in loose loungewear, her body seemed to vanish within the oversized fabric. Her neckline was damp, and she shivered as cold air blew through the open door, hugging herself tightly. This was Lao Zhou's first impression of her, like a stick insect from a nature documentary. Her frail body extended into thin limbs, fragile and easily breakable. Even Lao Zhou, known for his fearsome demeanor, instinctively softened in front of Song Jin. Here, wipe yourself, Lao Zhou said, handing her a tissue awkwardly. Song Jin lowered her head without a word. She took the tissue and clumsily wiped her face. Lao Zhou watched as the tissue became soaked, leaving him at a loss for words. This was the hardest part for Lao Zhou, facing the victim's family. Words felt too hollow, so he could only try his best to catch the culprit as soon as possible. When did you find out? Lao Zhou asked routinely. The maid was the one who reported the crime. She said Song Jin had gone out to meet friends that evening, leaving the victim alone at home, so the maid was given the night off. She initially planned to return to her hometown, but the heavy snow stopped the buses. She returned to find the victim lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Terrified, she ran downstairs and, after calming herself, found a public phone to call the police. Song Jin had returned during the maid's absence. Upon entering the house and seeing the scene, she froze before bursting into tears, sobbing and wailing in pain. Lao Zhou patted Song Jin's arm to comfort her. As his hand paused on her thin loungewear, he felt an abnormal bump beneath it. The victim, Song Niangua, had a complex social circle. He initially made his fortune in construction before suffering a serious illness in middle age, leading him to establish the Huitong Foundation. Lao Zhou had watched his recorded speeches. This slightly overweight man in a well-tailored suit spoke with conviction, captivating his audience. I, Song Niangua, have experienced every hardship, hauling cargo, building railroads. I'll be honest, I even stole steel from construction sites. Song Niangua raised his hand for emphasis. A single nail could buy 2 vegetable buns. I felt ashamed, but I was starving. My parents passed away early, leaving me alone to fend for myself. I had no choice. The camera panned over the audience, many of whom were wiping tears. That's why I founded the Huitong Foundation, to ensure children never go hungry and have access to education. Standing tall on the podium, Song Niangua raised his hands like a deity, making a solemn vow, while his followers bowed in reverence. Song Niangua had a complex social network, with a wide range of past jobs, from government officials to street thugs, and he was involved in both business and charity work. Guo Linhai suggested deploying more personnel to quickly investigate the web of relationships, convinced that this was likely a case of revenge. However, after taking action, they encountered significant resistance. Various people from all walks of life obstructed their investigation, and Song Niangua seemed to have become an untouchable secret, entangled in webs of influence. The closer they got, the more they were hindered. In Lao Zhou's mind, the image of Song Niangua standing on a high platform, speaking passionately with the crowd applauding beneath him, kept replaying. A sudden word flashed in Lao Zhou's mind. Saint. The next time Lao Zhou saw Song Jin was at Song Ninggua's morning hall. Inside the solemn and respectful setting, Song Jin was dressed in mourning clothes, kneeling at the center. Guests entered, knelt on the ground to burn 2 paper offerings, exchanged some pleasantries with Song Jin, lamented that good people don't live long, sighed, and left. Everything was done according to the standard, like a conveyor belt. Lao Zhou didn't go in. He stood by the doorframe for a long time. Have you caught the killer? Song Jin didn't turn around. She was placing paper offerings into a bronze basin, watching as the ashes fluttered in the fire, covering her body. Lao Zhou entered and squatted down, lighting a cigarette with the fire from the basin. He couldn't tell if the smoke was coming from the burning paper or from his own cigarette. He cursed, took a deep drag, and threw the half-burned cigarette into the basin. No, Lao Zhou replied dryly. He wasn't good at comforting people. Your father had a special identity, so we can't investigate him easily. Do you know who his enemies were? Song Jin shook her head. She had been studying away from home and spent very little time at the house. Her pale, dry hands froze. She crushed a gold ingot in her hands. It was Lao Zhang. It must have been him holding a grudge. Lao Zhang was Song Ninggua's driver. He had been with him for nearly 20 years, witnessing the rise and fall of Song's fortunes. Each time, Lao Zhang had followed him. Last month, Lao Zhang had been exposed as the mastermind behind the scandal involving the Huidong Foundation, which caused a huge uproar. Lao Zhang, handcuffed and shackled, had trembled while confessing his crime before the microphone. Song Ninggua was heartbroken. In front of the media, he swore he would repay the money Lao Zhang had stolen. His eyes red and voice choked. He said, Lao Zhang has been with me for half of my life, like my own brother. What he did is because I didn't teach him properly. I'll still give him another chance. I'll wait for him to be released from prison. The next sentence was for public relations, the one after it personal, but both conveyed a sense of brotherhood and loyalty. Song Ninggua bowed deeply. A single tear dropped on his shiny black leather shoes, standing out starkly. Another round of applause followed, moving everyone to tears. Saint. The thought appeared again in Lao Zhou's mind. Team Leader Zhou. The loud shout broke Lao Zhou's thoughts as he turned around. He glanced slightly to the side and saw Song Jin kneeling on the ground, tears streaming down her face, dripping from her chin like an ocean. Please, if you have any news, let me know first, she pleaded. Lao Zhou nodded and walked away from the morning hall. The snow had not stopped outside, light, icy, and fluffy. It fell softly on him as he walked with uneven steps. Lao Zhou said nothing. He felt as though a heavy weight was on his shoulders. But why? This wasn't his first murder investigation. Maybe because the victim was a saint, Lao Zhou thought. Lao Zhang had a daughter named Zhang Weiwei, about the same age as Song Jin, and the two families were closely connected. Song Ninggua had even attended campus events in the role of Zhang Weiwei's uncle. Lao Zhou did not notify anyone about his investigation into Zhang Weiwei. He waited under her building until dark, then saw her returning. He suddenly stood up, scaring her into taking a few steps back. Zhang Weiwei smiled politely after seeing Lao Zhou's badge. Compared to Song Jin, she looked even more like a young lady. She extended her hand. Hello. Lao Zhou didn't shake her hand and entered the house, pacing around. He stopped in front of a calligraphy piece, touched it, then leaned in to sniff it. This is Song Uncle's work. He likes writing and often gives me pieces of advice. It's his encouragement to me. Zhang Weiwei was not offended. She followed Lao Zhou, explaining, You're quite close. Lao Zhou studied the calligraphy. The ink was still fresh, as if it had been written recently. Zhang Weiwei seemed to notice Lao Zhou's intentions. Yes, Song Uncle has done much for our family. I'm very grateful to him. This piece was given to me last weekend. Grateful? Lao Zhou sneered. So, your family's way of showing gratitude is to take the blame for him? Zhang Weiwei tensed up for a moment, but quickly relaxed. She covered her mouth and lightly laughed, her camel-colored coat and scarlet nails creating an enchanting contrast. Her composed gaze made Lao Zhou feel slightly unnerved. Lao Zhou remembered the snow outside, how it fell and covered the morning hall, leaving only one color, white, an austere white that made his heart shiver. Song Jin had kneeled there, crying hysterically, begging for justice for her father. Lao Zhou took a sip from his thermos. It wasn't tea or soup, but the cheapest homemade liquor, its spiciness stinging as it ignited a fire within him. My father made mistakes. He has taken responsibility for them. I think there's no longer any collective punishment, right? Lao Zhou nodded, then baited her. Your father's case is under investigation again. Zhang Weiwei hesitated for a moment before putting on a composed smile, her inherent kindness and humility making her seem flawless. Thank you, but I think it's unnecessary to trouble my father any further. He's very old. The brief hesitation didn't escape Lao Zhou's notice. His sharp eyes locked onto Zhang Weiwei, connecting greed, sainthood, brotherly loyalty, and a crime scene without resistance. He could see the perfect story of vengeance her father had plotted. If he took one more step forward, he could find the axe Zhang Weiwei was using to chop through the barriers. When was last weekend again? Lao Zhou calculated. October 30th. Zhang Weiwei glanced at the calendar. Right, October 30th. Lao Zhou repeated. Was that the last time you saw Song Yinghua? Zhang Weiwei thought for a moment, then hesitated. We ate together later, on the second or third day of the Lunar New Year, probably the second. Lao Zhou didn't give her a chance to relax. He probed like a sharp tongue, waiting for a crack to appear, then struck decisively. Are you sure? Where were you on the 4th? What were you doing? Can anyone confirm? On the 4th, I was practicing because I had a performance the next day. Zhang Weiwei suddenly realized, then glared angrily at Lao Zhou. What do you mean? Are you suspecting me? Zhang Weiwei was a dancer, elegant and graceful, her neck delicate. When she questioned Lao Zhou, she resembled an unyielding water bird, proud and independent. But Lao Zhou couldn't stop thinking about her neck. So thin, so fragile, just a little force, and it could snap. To Lao Zhou, Zhang Weiwei was just as fragile. If he got a little closer, the truth would be within his grasp. After leaving Zhang Weiwei's house, old Zhou squatted on the curb and smoked half a pack of cigarettes. He didn't get up until his legs were numb and his head was spinning. When he finally stood up, he staggered and kicked the cigarette but scattered in front of him. Zhang Weiwei's face kept appearing in his mind. Despite his harsh words, she held her head high, unyielding. You know your father was innocent, forced by pressure to take the fall for Song Yinghua. You sought revenge for your father and killed him on the 4th of November. You and Song Yinghua were old acquaintances, so he had no defenses against you. You used a fruit knife from the Song family to slit his throat, and then you left. Old Zhou pressed Zhang Weiwei, taking a step forward with each accusation, pushing her into a corner. He spoke confidently, from a position of authority, presenting the facts as if he were an eyewitness. This was old Zhou's usual approach. He was skilled at using this tactic to break down his opponent's psychological defenses. Zhang Weiwei didn't panic, didn't get angry. Instead, she remained almost numb, eerily calm. Her eyes were like a calm lake, and staring into them, it seemed as though one could see a crane wading into the water. She said, "Did you pressure my father like this when you judged him?" She said, "If you believe Song Yinghua is the true murderer, you should clear my father's name, not force his daughter to confess." Her camel-colored coat made her face look even paler, her features gradually fading until only her mouth moved, like a pixel, blending with the calligraphy behind her. Old Zhou stared blankly for a moment, then blinked before recognizing the characters. Sanbukashi Bavajang. Goodness must not be lost. Evil must not be allowed to flourish. Officer Zhou, do you think my dad never met a good cop like you? Or, Zhang Weiwei's voice brought old Zhou back to his senses. Or, Do you think a good cop like you only serves people like Song Yinghua? What kind of person is Song Yinghua? A rich person, Zhang Weiwei said with a smile that reached the corners of her eyes and brows. Old Zhou didn't dare to ask what she was smiling about. He had escaped. He was upright, unyielding. From the first day he became a police officer, he swore to punish evil and promote good, to never wrong an innocent person, and to never let a guilty one go free. He upheld this principle and believed that the brothers he fought alongside also maintained this bottom line. In 2004, when the Sky Eye system wasn't as developed, there were no dense surveillance cameras to provide an alibi for Zhang Weiwei. Old Zhou retraced the path from the dance studio to Zhang's house. He asked every street vendor, watched every shop's surveillance footage, trying to prove something. Old Zhou saw old Zhang in prison. In just a month, he had aged considerably. His mouth gaped open, producing only wheezing sounds. His throat had been pierced with a large hole, black as the depths of winter, as though it wanted to suck old Zhou in. He swallowed fire alkali himself, Guo Linhai said. Maybe he was trying to take the route of being released on medical bail, but he didn't get the dosage right. He'll probably be like this for the rest of his life. Old Zhou didn't speak. He glanced at old Zhang, then walked out. Leaning against a tree in the yard, he gasped for air. It felt like the air was spinning inside his lungs before escaping. The higher-ups are rushing things, but we have no leads. Should we consider suicide? Guo Linhai came out after him, carefully speaking. I know the evidence isn't enough, and the motive hasn't been fully investigated, but the situation is causing panic. With the new year coming up, if this kind of unrest spreads, it could lead to a riot. We should prioritize things. Old Zhou leaned against the tree, as though he had become part of it, his neck twisting like a branch. He struggled to turn his head and looked at Guo Linhai. In that moment, the image of Zhang Weiwei in her camel coat leaving the dance studio at 8:30 p.m., the sight of old Zhang's face with a gaping hole in his throat, and Song Jinru's shriveled back like a dead leaf butterfly all flashed before his eyes. Old Zhou felt dizzy. The strongest, most trusted line in his heart snapped. Old Zhou became a lonely man. The special investigation team barely functioned, and only old Zhou still held on. With no leads, he asked around, visiting one house after another. With no breakthroughs, he repeatedly examined the scene. He dedicated himself completely to this case. If the charitable funds from the Huitong Foundation weren't embezzled by old Zhang, the only possibility left was that Song Yinghua had moved the money. But when he checked Song Yinghua's accounts, there were no large sums, just a maximum balance of about 100,000 yuan. A wealthy entrepreneur, a philanthropist, living in a luxurious home surrounded by golden decorations, with only 100,000 yuan in savings? Was that possible? Old Zhou kept looking at Song Yinghua's image, watching him swear an oath, raise his hand, and seeing the followers cheering and crying, chanting slogans. He downed a large glass of liquor, feeling the burn in his throat and esophagus. His internal fire felt just as scorching, wanting to burn a hole in the sky. With a smack, a folder slammed onto his desk. Old Zhou raised his eyelids, but didn't look at the person who entered. I had someone look into Song Yinghua's accounts. He started transferring assets half a month ago. All the money went into an overseas account. I checked the account holder. It's Gao Fian, a local, Guo Linhai reported coldly. I've checked him. He has a close relationship with Song Yinghua and has been in secret contact with him. It's very likely that he killed for money. Old Zhou only grunted in response, which caused Guo Linhai to explode in anger. Stop with a long face. If you want to find the real murderer, it's for the people. I hope to resolve this quickly, too, for the sake of social stability. I'm not worse than you. If I hadn't mediated, you would have been sidelined by the higher-ups. You'd still be sitting here, investigating, or back at your hearth playing with birds. Guo Linhai shouted, his saliva flying. Old Zhou looked at him, but seemed not to be looking at him at all. Guozi, you're more suited to be the director than I am. When the police arrested Gao Fian, he was packing his luggage. Luxury watches and gold bars were scattered on the floor, gleaming in the light. When he saw the police break down the door, Gao Fian panicked and tried to escape through the window. Old Zhou was quick and pinned him to the ground. Gao Fian looked young, barely in his 20s, with slick hair and a sharp suit. He appeared tall and elegant. As his face was pressed into the ground, he begged, "Why are you arresting me? I didn't do anything." Old Zhou didn't give him a chance to finish his sentence. He elbowed Gao Fian in the face, causing his nose to bleed all over. Gao Fian opened his mouth but didn't dare make another sound. Unregulated but effective. In those days, such methods were shortcuts to solving cases. Even in the interrogation room, Gao Fian wasn't peaceful. He alternated between claiming his innocence and demanding a lawyer, throwing a tantrum. But Old Zhou knew how to handle such people, and in just a few words, Gao Fian opened up. Outside the interrogation room, Song Jinru's brows were tightly furrowed, a hint of satisfaction hidden in her nervousness. Song Jin was contacted by Old Zhou, who told her that the real murderer had been found, and that Song Ningguo could now rest in peace. Old Zhou's words were abrupt, and over the phone, Song Jin was stunned, her voice trembling. Is that true? As soon as she arrived, she saw Gao Fian with his face covered in blood, and it was as if she had returned to the day Song Ningguo died. The blood was the same, spurting from his neck, spraying across his face, the floor, and even the ceiling, sticky and foul-smelling. Song Jin stood in the midst of the blood, her once great father now a silent heap of flesh. She was lost and helpless, only able to wipe her face and cry. "What was your relationship with Song Ningguo?" Old Zhou casually tapped on the desk. Having learned his lesson, Gao Fian was much more docile. His lips trembled as he muttered, "Lover." "Bullshit," Old Zhou shouted. No one knew how the small, somewhat fragile girl rushed into the interrogation room, but by the time the officers reacted, Song Jin had bitten off half of Gao Fian's ear. The blood hung from her mouth, like a bloodthirsty vampire. "Song Jin," Old Zhou said, his tone flat and indifferent, almost seeming indulgent to outsiders. "Stop lying. My dad and mom have been married for 30 years. What kind of lover? Don't smear my dad's name." Song Jin's eyes were bloodshot, her arms violently reaching forward, as though she wanted to tear a piece of flesh from Gao Fian to feel better. Gao Fian clutched his ear, blood dripping through his fingers. Drip, drip. In the noise, it was barely noticeable, but Old Zhou heard it clearly. "I slander your dad? You go to hell. It was your dad who pursued me first." Gao Fian snapped, trying to provoke Song Jin. "You think your dad is some kind of saint? He's been with me for a long time. Your mom probably even knew about it. She might have been driven to death by him." "Yeah, the money came from your dad. He was planning to leave the country and live with me overseas. After the foundation collapsed, he planned to escape. He started moving his assets a long time ago." Old Zhang swallowing the fire alkali wasn't to get medical bail. Your dad had someone do it. He was afraid Old Zhang would betray him. You should know better than anyone what kind of person your dad is. Why are you pretending now? The man's voice was deep and forceful, spilling secrets in frustration, his words drilling into everyone's ears. Back in 2004, society was still conservative. Two men could be brothers, father and son, but never lovers. This scandal was enough to shame the family, to destroy Song Ningguo's carefully built image, to ruin his reputation. Song Jin went silent, her mind blank. She stared around, shaking her head desperately. Everyone was watching her. She wanted to explain, but when she opened her mouth, a wave of blood and bile surged in her throat. The last thing she saw before collapsing was Old Zhou's meaningful gaze. With a breakthrough, Gao Fian confessed quickly. The saying, "Birds of a feather flock together," applied here, as they shared a twisted bond. Following the lead, they found another account belonging to Song Ningguo. Back in 2004, it wasn't as tightly regulated, and one could buy a real-name bank card for just a few hundred. Song Ningguo had exploited this loophole. The account only had deposits, ranging from a few thousand to tens of thousands. Old Zhou took it seriously and visited a few households based on recent transfer records. Under the streetlights, Old Zhou sucked deeply on his cigarette until the ember nearly burned his hand, before tossing it away. The discarded cigarette butt melted the thin ice, and it felt like something in his heart cracked open too. Guo Linhai sighed and tried to comfort him. It's fate. What nonsense fate, Old Zhou scoffed. It's our fault for not doing our job, for dereliction of duty. When they traced the payments, the senders all denied ever making a transfer. When Old Zhou showed the transaction records, everyone fell silent. Following the clues, Old Zhou found a school, isolated, without any signage. If not for the exact coordinates, he wouldn't have found it. In his notebook, Old Zhou wrote just one line about the school. It's a concentration camp located within civilized boundaries, where children become criminals. At that moment, Old Zhou realized the ugly truth behind the saintly facade. The so-called reform school was just a euphemism for a punishment chamber. The children, facing the rescuing police, only displayed panic or numbness. Old Zhou read the notes behind the names on the roster. Disruptive, internet addiction, early relationships, and many others like Song Jin, marginalized and violently labeled as bad kids, who were sent to this so-called concentration camp. Old Zhou personally opened a small, cramped confinement room. As soon as the children saw his police uniform, they stood up straight, their faces showing mechanical smiles. Hello, police officer. I came here voluntarily. I really like it here. The teachers are kind, the students are friendly, and they help me correct my bad habits. I really like it here. Old Zhou turned his head, unable to bear looking any longer. They not only physically abused the children, but also mentally tortured them, leaving them isolated and helpless. The children had been forced to rehearse the lines they were to say in front of police and parents over and over again. No questions, no resistance. Obedience was the only way to survive. Looking at the roster, Old Zhou saw Song Jin's name. He thought about those thin, branch-like arms, covered in scars. Now, everything made sense. Song Jin had also been one of the prisoners of this concentration camp. Old Zhou felt a trace of respect for her. Beneath those scars was an indomitable soul, the mark of someone fighting for survival. And the true culprit behind all this suffering was none other than her father, the ever-kind, ever-compassionate Song Nianghua. From the moment he saw the children's eyes, Old Zhou had nightmares for 20 years. Every time he closed his eyes, the problem children sent by their parents and the kids imprisoned by Song Nianghua under the guise of rescue would appear. More than 100 children huddled together, numb, trembling, terrified, trying to please and fawn. They were scarred, robotic, fearful, and mechanically introduced themselves with forced smiles. Hello, police officer. I came here voluntarily. I really like it here. The teachers are kind, the students are friendly, and they help me correct my bad habits. I really like it here. Hello, police officer. In the hospital, Old Zhou returned with the roster. The last person Song Jin saw before she fainted was Old Zhou, and the first person she saw when she woke up was also him. She wanted to say something, but when she looked down, she saw the handcuffs on her wrists. One end was shackled to her wrist, and the other to Old Zhou's. She lay back down, closed her eyes, and tears flowed down to her pillow. She had struggled in that re-education camp for 2 years and spent 2 years with a wet pillow like this. Today is your mother's Sanqi, Old Zhou spoke. Within a month, the Song family lost 2 members, and the girl in the bed became an orphan. Song Nianghua publicly stated that his wife had passed away due to overwork and illness. He donated a large sum of money in memory of his late wife, and everyone praised him for his loyalty and kindness. It wasn't until Gao Fian appeared that the true cause of her death was revealed. A small bottle of poison had been mixed into her food, killing her without anyone noticing. Everything was a final step before Song Nianghua's escape. He sacrificed the life of the woman who had been with him for decades to ensure his own safety. Song Jin, like Old Zhou, didn't believe in ghosts or gods, but she still built a small fire downstairs at the hospital. The flames flickered across her face, casting shifting shadows. Old Joe stood beside her, the shadow in his eyes shifting in the same way. "Officer Zhou, do you think the dead can hear us?"
Song Jin asked.
She didn't care about Old Joe's answer. She stood up and stomped on the fire. Sparks flew in all directions, and Song Jin, like a moth to the flame, became a striking figure in the flickering light. When a person dies, they become nothing but rotten meat. I don't believe in any kind of karmic cycle of good and evil. If it really existed, why are the people who should die still alive and well? Song Jin shouted, her voice raw with emotion. "I'm sorry." Old Joe's reply was dry. He wasn't the perpetrator, but he still felt guilty. Looking down at his police uniform, Old Joe thought that by doing nothing, he himself was wrong. Song Jin stretched out her hand to show her arm, covered in scars. Her skin was torn and rolled. "My father cared about face, about appearances, and kept my mother bound to him for 30 years. He never communicated with her. He pushed his wife to madness, watching her suffer from the sidelines. I never understood why such a gentle man in front of others could be so indifferent at home." Song Jin sneered. She raised her scarred arm, pushing her stray hair behind her ear. "After seeing Gao Fian, I finally understood. He wasn't normal either." Song Jin laughed hysterically, tears spilling from her eyes. Old Joe keenly noticed the word also. "My blood runs through my veins. I am just like him." Song Jin's status as an outsider made Song Niangua suspicious. He was a businessman, a philanthropist, the Uncle Song of countless children on camera. His life allowed no stains, especially when it came to his daughter. So, he personally sent her to that re-education camp. To maintain his normality, he married his wife but remained indifferent to her until he drove her mad. For the sake of his reputation, he imprisoned his outsider daughter. For money and property, he amassed wealth under the guise of helping children. For safety, he treated those vulnerable children, those with no support, as treasures to exchange for favors, making them the victims of Song Niangua's power games. When everything came to light, those who had followed him for years were made scapegoats. That wasn't enough for him, so he had one of them poisoned. Song Jin had asked her father, could he stop? Song Niangua had been calmly peeling an apple, the peel falling to the floor in long, perfect strips. The flesh was white and tender, and the sound of him biting into it was crisp, the juice splashing. She imagined herself and the other children stripped bare, drained of everything, and shuddered with a twisted excitement. She feverishly grabbed the knife covered in apple juice. The knife was drawn, raised, and slashed down. By the time she regained her senses, Song Niangua was lying on the floor, clutching his neck as blood poured from him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. Song Jin couldn't tell if it was for justice or for personal vengeance. She crouched next to him, gazing at his familiar yet strange face. "Dad, now you will never ruin the dignity that everyone sacrificed for you." After changing clothes, showering, and destroying the clothes, Song Jin had everything planned. The only variable was that she hadn't anticipated the bus being cancelled due to the heavy snow or the nanny returning. Luckily, the nanny was scared off, giving Song Jin the last bit of time. Old Zhou closed his eyes. He remembered Zhang Weiwei standing before that painting, her eyes watery, her neck held high. He had seen Zhang Weiwei's name in the roster. She was the first victim. Her father had been the scapegoat for Zhang Niangua. Her daughter was Zhang Niangua's first pawn in his network. It wasn't until now that Old Zhou realized the painting wasn't a piece of encouragement from an elder to a younger generation. It was a reminder, a threat, a blatant display of Zhang Niangua's manipulation, a mockery of the family after he had consumed them whole. She had said, "I beg you, stop investigating. If you knew what Song Niangua did to us, you would forgive the killer." She had said, "My father voluntarily swallowed the lie. He did it to protect me." Old Zhou thought back to the words on the painting, written in bold, powerful characters. good must not be lost, evil must not last. His hand trembled as he involuntarily laughed. He laughed at how Song Niangua had controlled the concepts of good and evil, how those in power manipulated the suffering of others, and how absurd this world truly was. Through the iron bars, Song Jin's face was divided into many segments. Old Zhou didn't dare to look directly into her eyes. He wanted to ask Song Jin why she hadn't reported the crime, why she had chosen such a tragic and fatal way to take down the mastermind. But the words caught in his throat, leaving only a dry silence. Old Zhou pulled out a cigarette, squeezing it in his hand, but never lighting it. Because he knew better than anyone. Song Jin had escaped from that school countless times, had begged, and had resisted, only to be crushed every time. She couldn't fight the entire system, which was why she had so decisively ended the tragedy in the only way she could, by taking her father's life. In 2004, the famous Black Leopard solved 114 murder cases before retreating to the front lines, shifting from criminal detective to community officer, where his biggest task was cooperating with the fire department to deal with trivial matters. They said the Black Leopard had been scared. Old Zhou wrote in his journal, "Anyone can be the Black Leopard, but the hard part is preventing things before they escalate." The iron bars separated the two into opposing camps, one inside, the other outside. Old Zhou opened his mouth but only breathed in the cold air. In the end, he sighed at her. The school has been shut down. Old Zhou never married in his life, but at his funeral, children of all ages kneeled down for half a street. I added a handful of paper money to the copper basin, and the flames surged, as if wanting to burn away all the filth in the world. I remembered the many times Old Zhou had asked me a question. He poured himself some cheap white liquor, furrowed his brows, and clicked his tongue. "Xiao Shi, do you think the police protect people, or do they protect order?" Through the iron bars, Song Jin once asked him, "When did you suspect that I was the killer?" Old Zhou's voice was thick with a nasal tone, his throat seemingly blocked. At the very beginning. Old Zhou was the Black Leopard, and Song Jin's little tricks were far too clumsy for him to miss. He saw through her lies about the friends gathering with just one look. The damp color of her casual wear and the water stains on the bathroom mirror confirmed that she had just showered. Song Jin's behavior was too perfect. Her sorrow over her father's death, her anger at Gao Fian. Her responses were so flawless they could only be acts. Old Zhou played along, using the tiny flaws Song Jin revealed to expose the maggots under Song Niangua's saintly mask. In the end, Old Zhou made a difficult decision. In 2004, he chose to uphold order, and for the next 20 years, he worked to protect the people, personally managing those children seen as unstable elements, doing his best to prevent future issues. Carrying his guilt toward Song Jin, Old Zhou redeemed himself for 20 years, even if he had done right by the people and his uniform. On the eve of his retirement, Old Zhou chose to end his life with the same fruit knife that Song Jin had used to deal with Song Niangua. The plastic handle had cracked, but the blade remained sharp, cutting through his flesh and tasting his blood. The maze he had wandered alone for 20 years had finally come to an end. By the way, Old Zhou's surname was Zhou, a single character, Min. Director Guo wiped his face. "My name is Guo Linhai. I lack water and wood in my fate. This kid, though, was born to be a cop. Even his name has Min in it. Damn it, even in death, he's outdoing me," Director Guo cursed. The mourners wept, and the sound of the Suona played. "Old Zhou, may you rest in peace."